Alright guys, so Glenn Greenwald a couple days ago sat down with Alan Dershowitz to debate something that I think most reasonable people probably would assume doesn't really need to be debated. The broad question that they were handling here is whether or not the United States and Israel should preemptively attack Iran, presumably starting a war with Iran, in order to prevent them from obtaining nuclear weapons in the future. So I won't subject you guys to the entirety of this conversation. I'll link it down below in the description if you want to go watch the whole 2-hour back and forth that they had. This seems to be the clip that's been making the rounds of Glenn Greenwald just absolutely thoroughly demolishing Alan Dershowitz's position here. This clip is specifically on the recent attacks by Iran, which were retaliatory attacks after Israel had struck the Iranian embassy in Syria, and then Iran basically retaliated by lobbing a bunch of missiles and drones that were basically universally intercepted and didn't actually hit their targets. So let's go ahead and watch this short little clip here, and then we'll expand on what the broader debate was actually about.
That Iran did not want to kill Israelis, that it sent these hundreds of drones knowing they would all be miraculously stopped. Can you justify that?
Yeah, what I want to say is if Iran has such a primitive army that they're not capable of landing even a single missile inside Israel because all they have is a bunch of crappy drones and slow missiles that can be removed from the sky by Jordan and by the United Arab Emirates, then they're hardly an imposing country. The reality is that Hezbollah...
All you need is one to get through.
Alan, please.
One, that's all you need.
Hezbollah has hundreds of, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of highly sophisticated missiles pointed directly at every single major Israeli city, including Tel Aviv. If Iran wanted to do a kind of response against Israel that you're suggesting they wanted, they had that capability, and they didn't because they're a rational, restrained country that didn't want to end up in a world war. I know, the only rational, restrained countries are America, Israel, and the West. That's what your media tells you all the time, so I know that you believe that. But there are actually other rational, restrained countries in the world, too. You're always told there's a new Hitler in Iran, there's a new Hitler in Russia, there's a new Hitler named Hamas, there's a new Hitler in Syria, and you believe it all the time, and you stand up and you cheer all those evil, irrational countries. As I said, if you look at who the ones are who are starting wars, it is your country, the United States, and along with Israel as well. And that is just the reality if you remove yourself from Western propaganda.
I mean, listen, it's hard to argue with what Glenn was just outlining there. I mean, even just in the example specific to what they were talking about, I mean, what happened here is Israel launched an attack on an embassy that was inside of Syria. It was an Iranian embassy, and they blew up an entire building that was like attached to the main portion of the embassy. And then in response to that, Iran retaliated by lobbing a bunch of missiles. They telegraphed it beforehand so that this coalition of the United States and Israel and Lebanon and several other countries as well were able to plan for it and to intercept basically the entirety of the missiles and drones that were launched towards Israel. It was a very calculated thing that Iran did there. So to turn around and to just, I guess, continue pretending as if Iran is just totally unhinged, all they want is the destruction of Israel, they are hell-bent on that as a goal, and nothing is going to get in their way of that, not even self-preservation, to me is just outright delusional, right? And so Glenn, I think, is 100% correct about it being primarily, at least, the United States and Israel that have been the aggressor in this region. And that was one of the funniest parts about Alan Dershowitz's argument that I heard in his opening statement, is that he fully acknowledges that the invasion by the United States and our coalition of Iraq was a complete and utter disaster, top to bottom. And he outlines the arguments for why it was a disaster decently well, but then he can't apply that same exact logic to the current war that he's trying to advocate for with Iran. Suddenly it's like, well, this is going to be completely different this time. This time it'll be easy. This time it'll be simple. You know, there's not going to be any sort of like broader tangential, consequences from that. I mean, it's amazing, right? We have this ability to look backwards into just recent history and to see absolute disasters that unfolded. We know exactly what led up to these disasters, but then in real time, people just have like a block. They can't possibly see how that could apply to the current thing and not just something that happened in history. So that's incredibly frustrating. That was one of the main things that he highlighted in his opening statement, right? Was that this is going to be easy. We're basically just going to do a little, little tip tap on Iran's nuclear facilities. We'll be in and out. It'll be super quick and it won't, broaden into this massive regional thing. That was one of the core parts of his argument. Another core part of his argument was that Iran is basically the new Nazis. That was sort of a core part of his opening statement. In fact, I think that was the majority of his opening statement, was actually talking about the rise of Adolf Hitler and how there was certain, appeasement by the, future allied countries that basically didn't attack Germany quick enough, right? And that allowed Germany to gain steam and to gain power, and then that inevitably spiraled into World War II. And he's applying that same logic to Iran, as if the government of Iran has the same sort of expansionary priorities as the government of Nazi Germany, which is just like bizarre. I mean, if we're being real here, guys, the reason that Iran wants nuclear weapons, okay, it's very simple. It's very easy. All right, they are actually decently rational when it comes to foreign policy. That doesn't mean I agree with the government of Iran and their positions and especially their domestic policy, but just from a regional perspective, from an international perspective, they are rational in the sense that they want to preserve the current order of Iran. They don't want to just, give way to a situation in which they bomb the shit out of Israel and then Iran is destroyed by Israel and the United States. In fact, they've gone out of their way to avoid escalation, to avoid war with Israel and the United States. They could have retaliated, as Glenn was pointing out there in that clip, significantly harsher than they did after Israel attacked their embassy. They could have used Hezbollah. They could have directly launched attacks that they thought would be more, successful in terms of hitting their targets. There were a number of different things they could have done. They chose not to do those things in order to prevent that broader war that I think Israel desperately wants to take place. And we saw this as well with the United States being the aggressor under the Trump administration when he went and just assassinated a top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, at the time. And even then, Iran was acting as the more restrained actor. So the point that I'm trying to make here is not that I'm a fan of the government of Iran, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they are a rational actor in a geopolitical sense. And that's important because if you're going to try to compare them to the Nazis, okay, and act as if they have massive expansionary goals and they're going to try to conquer the rest of the Middle East or something, or they're going to get their hands on a nuke and immediately launch it at Israel, then you're completely missing the plot. And that is going to lead to disastrous policy decisions when it comes to issues like, should we invade Iran, right? And that was another big point that he was making throughout this, right? So we have the main point, I think, was that he thinks this is going to be pretty easy, right? It's not going to be a duplicate of what happened in Iraq, which is delusional. If anything, it's going to be worse than what happened in Iraq. Point number two is he's like erroneously comparing the government of Iran to the government of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi German party. And then point number three that he was trying to get at was that, again, Iran is completely irrational, right? Here's the simplified version of what would need to happen in order to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. I would be more comfortable if Iran did not have nuclear weapons. But again, it's very clear that the reason they want it is for self-preservation, not for expansionary goals, not just to go and blow up Israel the second they get their hands on it. It's for protection. It is for self-preservation of the current government of Iran, which is kind of important when you have guys like Alan Dershowitz and John Bolton and plenty of other neocons and warhawks who desperately want to do war in Iran. They want regime change in Iran. So if the reason that they want nuclear weapons is for self-preservation reasons, then the way that you prevent them from getting nuclear weapons is pretty much what the Obama administration did. Okay, if we're being real here, the Iran nuclear deal that was in place before Trump ripped it into a million pieces under his administration, that deal was working to, in the meantime, prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And in exchange, we will slowly start to welcome them back into the international community, right? We will loosen the sanctions that we have on Iran. That's the actual strategy to avoid war and to avoid getting, allowing Iran to get nuclear weapons. That's the strategy. It's diplomacy. As Glenn Greenwald put it later on in this debate, it's basically just convincing Iran, who again is concerned with self-preservation, it's convincing Iran that it is in their own security interests to not obtain a nuclear weapon. We will welcome you into the international community. We will drop our sanctions if you agree to not develop further towards a nuclear weapon. Now, the issue with that now is that the United States can't be fucking trusted, because we had a deal like that was on the table, and then Trump ripped it into a million pieces. And since then, the Biden administration hasn't exactly been trying to resurrect that deal. They could have tried to do that at the beginning of Biden's, first term in office. That could have potentially been on the table. We've since kind of moved past that window, and now we put ourselves in an incredibly difficult position, didn't we? Right now, whose fault is that? Did Iran pull out of the nuclear deal? No, of course not. I mean, it's just like, it's a ridiculous conversation to be having. And the arguments that, at least from what I heard from Alan Dershowitz, are basically just a regurgitation of the same exact arguments that were used to get us into Iraq, which is, again, amazingly ironic, because he even admits that there were lies that got us into Iraq, that it was a complete disaster that got us into Iraq, right? So he admits the failures when it comes to that, but then he has these blinders on when it comes to this hypothetical war with Iran. We'll just get in, we'll get in and out. We'll just attack their nuclear facilities. It's not going to be anything bigger than that. It's not going to spiral into World War III or anything like that. Now, I'll finish off with this, right? Because again, it's Alan Dershowitz that we're talking about here. Not exactly the most, not exactly the most like coherent sort of political thought leader, to say the least. He's had some, pretty strange positions throughout the years, and this was one that floated across my timeline just about a week ago at this point. I thought it was kind of interesting to get an insight in into his mindset here. So let's go ahead and listen to Alan Dershowitz saying that the worst departments in terms of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel are Jewish studies departments. Let's listen to this real quick.
Tell you, the worst department in terms of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel department are Jewish studies departments. Why? Who's hired to become a Jewish studies professor? They're talking dogs. Let me explain who they are. They are failed Israeli professors. They couldn't get a job at Tel Aviv. They couldn't get a job in Bar Ilan. They couldn't get a job in Hebrew University. And so they come to America. And there are thousands of them, third and fourth rate Israelis, who come to America. And if you say, hey, I'm an Israeli and I support Netanyahu and I graduated the Herzliya Institute, you're not getting the job. But if you're a talking dog, I'm an Israeli, but I'm a virulent anti-Zionist, you're getting the job. And so Jewish Studies Department, Hebrew Studies, Holocaust Studies Department are populated by the worst anti-Zionists and some of the worst self-hating Jews.
So, in other words, if you are a Jewish American, okay, especially if you're a professor at one of these universities, God forbid, but if you are just generally an American Jew and you happen to be critical of the Israeli government or the Benjamin Netanyahu government or of Zionism in general, then you are a self-hating Jew. That's what he's outlining here, right? The only true Jewish people are the ones who fully support this apartheid state that's in the middle of committing a genocide, right? That's essentially what he's getting at here. And you see the glaring conflation, the dishonest conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel, right? So Alan Dershowitz, not exactly the source that I would personally go to when I'm trying to get opinions on, let's say, literally anything. Glenn Greenwald, of course, being Glenn Greenwald, typically has good takes when it comes to anti-war positions, and just thoroughly embarrassing Alan Dershowitz in this. I mean, again, the underlying conversation, to me at least, is not one that really needs to be debated. Okay, should we go to war with Iran and spark off a situation that would be incalculably worse than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? No. The answer to that is no. If you want to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, we already saw what the playbook was for that. We fucked that up. The United States of America fucked that up. Okay, so to turn around and to say, well, we have no other options now on the table other than to preemptively go to war with Iran to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons, to me at least, is utterly deranged.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying